So let me treat you to a variation of the Come Dessus theme. I would call my paper Global and National Solidarity. That's local in my sense, is national, and I think national has become local. Some issues of globalization around the welfare state. Let me start with an epitaph. I think half of you or even more of you will know it. Ill fares the land, to hastening ill a prey, where wealth accumulates and man decay. Princes and lords may flourish or may fade. A breath can make them as a breath has made. But a bold peasantry, their country's pride, when once destroyed, can never be supplied. Just substitute citizenry for peasantry, substitute something else for the princes and the lords, and you will be in 2012 and not in Ireland and England of the time that Peter Schallenberg alluded to. It's a citation by Oliver Goldschmidt from the mid-18th century, and I think it also gives the title to the volume by Tony Judd, Ill Fares the Land, which is about the US today. I will focus on 4 points. In the first 3, I am looking at the historical trajectory of the issue, and in the 4th, I'm looking at the EU case. So here we go. First, most of us live the moment and we behave as if the end of history was already here. Applied to globalization, we had a first era of globalization setting in with the 1870s and suddenly ending with the guns of August. August 1914, World War I, that is. Then we had 2 world wars, accompanied by closed nation states, by container states, to shorten, abbreviate it a bit, until about the 1970s. Then a second era of globalization sets in, made possible by a concerted action of the OECD states. Globalization is a delicate political construction and not a force majeure. We take it for granted. We may today be at a turning point. And what we vaguely describe as financial crisis since 2008, which are actually several crises crammed into one, may simply be the superficial expression of having reached a turning point in the second era of globalization. Globalization may end, or it may need a quite different supporting structure to remain viable. Band-aids won't do anymore. If globalization ends, the historically informed subsidiarity principle will tell us the old container state is a routine we will be falling back on to. First of all in the US, but also in Europe. Second, now where does the welfare state come in? Well, we all tend to live in democracies, and the forces crying out for protection or protectionism have always been strong. And those are massive forces. If you systematically offer universal social security, you have established a firewall that redirects protectionist pressures, recycles these pressures, and thus allows for opening international markets. You can see the welfare state at work as an agent of change management. At first, it grows in container states. This people like Gunnar Myrdal and Wilhelm Röpke foresaw in the war years, but they did not foresee that the welfare state also allowed a slow and steady cracking of the shells of these container states, i.e., it would actually repave the way for the globalization of markets. They thought globalization had vanished forever with World War I. In all of Western Europe, the 1950s and 60s saw the universalization of the welfare state, a big growth spurt, followed by the cracking of the nation-state shells from the 1970s on. If you look at the US in Roosevelt's time, you will see a similar twinning, a first systematic opening up for international trade, accompanied by the building of social security. But the US never developed as far as the West European nations did in terms of the welfare state, though it stayed on their path until the 1970s. Instead of universalizing its welfare state, it actually built special welfare programs. It actually built special welfare programs aimed at the unemployed affected by globalization, etc. Since it didn't have a universal welfare state, it had to find equivalents in the age of globalization, as long as it wanted to uphold that age. Maybe you now see why today all OECD nations on average spend some 22.4% of their GNP on welfare state programs. That equals to about 50% of all public spending. The Chicago economists will say the US doesn't fit. True, it's below average with 17.4% of GNP, but is quite above average with 10.4% in terms of net current voluntary social expenditure plus net current mandatory social expenditure, i.e. what one in short might call the submerged tax-privileged welfare state. If you add these two figures of welfare state action in the US, you get 27.8% of GNP, which is equivalent to all of Western Europe. But the high share of the submerged tax-privileged welfare state makes for less efficiency and inequality, i.e. you spend a lot for welfare but still allow a two-nation situation to develop. You actually cultivate a two-nation situation. That makes you special, and it is worth a thought or two from the standpoint of US Catholic social teaching. After all, Catholicism rests on universalism and not on two or three class societies, neither on earth nor in heaven. Well, in heaven, actually, it does. Maybe it is important to note that we've experienced a climate change in welfare statism since the oil crisis of the early 1970s, and especially since the 1990s. But while we've seen some reshuffling, we haven't actually seen a downsizing of the welfare state. When we look at the OECD statistics, what we've seen is moderated growth of welfare statism and a decrease in inequality reduction. Thus, it is important to remember welfare statism, national solidarity, was a prerequisite for the political unfolding of globalization. If this safety valve gets damaged in the process without us building an equivalent for it, we may simply be removing the safety valve the functioning of globalization itself rests on. You can apply this thought to Europeanization and the Southern Rim states as well in the present-day situation. More on this later. Point 4. Third, how did we get there after World War II? Well, it may be news to you, but World War II was a war fought over the welfare state. It was the alternative future to fascism, what the Allies fought for and promised their citizens and to the potential losers was that. If you look at the Churchill-Roosevelt 1941 Atlantic Charter, 2 out of 8 war aims addressed social security and labor issues. Not only was there Roosevelt's freedom from fear and want, but there was a 1942 beverage plan, and the Nazis also prepared a beverage plan of their own at the same time to compete. And the US came out, which is also interesting, looked at it from today, as a welfare state development godfather after World War II, and stayed on that course until the end of the Nixon era, a president that actually competes with Lyndon B. Johnson for the most welfare statist US president. Remember, Nixon had Patrick Moynihan at his side. I think most of you will know him. Why am I stressing this point? Well, Roger Myerson yesterday remarked on US future leadership in upholding global peace. Such US leadership requires not only global military might, etc., but it requires that US society is perceived as a global model worth emulating. And you yourself always saw it this way. You were founded as a city on the hill, as the New Jerusalem. From World War II to the 1970s, the US was widely perceived as a social model that was able to assure domestic peace through social security and full employment at decent wages for everyone. Today you are rather seen as a house divided against itself, and you well know since 1858 it cannot stand in the long run. Maybe this sentence of Abraham Lincoln is properly alluded to in Illinois in a year of presidential elections. And also the title itself refers to the gospel, so it's doubly proper to quote Lincoln here. And thirdly, it characterizes the US situation as non-role model in things domestic today. Or to put it in another way, if the US wants to be a trustworthy agent of international peace, it will need to shape up domestically. But naturally, one would hope that this great awakening will have its original domestic causes. And why is it that a country that prides itself on Christian brotherhood in 240 denominations is unable to deliver here, for God's sake, while countries with simpler divisions like Germany or France are? So in a certain sense, you are well positioned to change, but in another sense, you seem to be totally blockaded for change. Fourth, now let's turn to Europe, to the European Union. The EU is part of the globalization enterprise. What is different and special about it is that it has already developed an institutional form that may give us a little more hope that for their part they can solve some of the problems I alluded to and maybe become a model of sorts. The EU already is a polity supplied with courts and parties and with a peculiar executive. The label for all of this is supranationalism. The OECD has none of this, and the globe hasn't either, and the US with NAFTA doesn't allow for much of that. The feeling in Europe generally is that these crises are not just about a technicality, about the Europe or its fallback national currencies. Rather, we seem to have arrived somehow at a turning point in European integration. Europe can either move forward toward a common fiscal and economic policy, which implies not only a common fiscal pact, that's where they're at, but also an explicit revenue-sharing device between the North and the South. You might call it an investment pact, and some breakthrough in social solidarity. You might label it European reinsurance of national social security systems. I could go into details, but I won't do it here. Or in short, a solidarity pact. You cannot solve the crisis of the southern rim with austerity alone. If you do, you create havoc. The alternatives to that cause are also easy to see. If the crisis can be contained to Greece as a sort of Puerto Rico of the EU, one could manage it in different ways. If it spreads to Italy, Spain, as well as to Portugal, as it is likely to, it will either provoke solution number one, the first one I mentioned, or it will involve the breakdown of the common currency. But if the common currency breaks down, that will not be a return to square one, i.e. the year 2000, sort of before we had a common currency. There will be a fallback to protectionist reactions along the North-South divide. The free movement of capital will be constrained, as will be the free movement of goods and services. This will also spread within the South. Whether this will spread within the North is anyone's guess, but probably it will, considering the French situation. In other words, the common integration project will rapidly unwind in more dimensions than the currency one. Until now, the EU construction has worked like a ratchet. For the Germans, eine Ratsche, ein Kinderspielzeug. Integration may have stood still for a while, but it intensified again and again since 1957. If you move the ratchet the other way, you'll break the instrument. That's where we are at. Russell Hittinger's remarks yesterday were quite apropos. The committee, with its weak stand on subsidiarity and the EU, is not yet a Lumen Christi throwing light on the way forward. And that is so in several respects. The committee is positioning itself, defending decentralized competences in a situation where the European house is falling apart and the center needs to be firmed up. And, second point, it is interpreting subsidiarity more in a US states' rights tradition. I always thought that subsidiarity was also about the center of a polity enabling the smaller units to do their jobs. But for that you need a working center, a polity, Hittinger called it, and one that is strong enough to be able to enable. With 1.2% of the EU GNP and a nation states close to 50% of GNP, that's impossible. At the moment, we seem to be building a polity, but one that is systematically disabled to enable. Maybe that's our similarity to the US. One that returns to intergovernmental rather than to supranational procedures in the face of an onslaught that requires radically strengthened supranationality. In all of this, the reining in, the re-civilization of the international financial markets is probably key. There seems to be a part of the capitalist class that has spearheaded the downfall of the old moral economy. I think Maureen O'Hara will address this. In the 1950s or 1960s, you wouldn't have accepted most of these high boni people in your country clubs because they have lost all sense of proportion and are out of touch with productive front lines of capitalism. Capitalism is one thing, but a capitalism with a lost moral compass, without a sense of proportion, with a black hole where innate fairness should reside, is a self-destructive creature. The traditional complement of the question, how much is enough, or the traditional question, how much is enough, has a 21st century complement in the one, how much is too much. And this is so in incomes and in wealth. Maybe with due respect to Michel Camdessus, I should mention the French counterexample of a high-up manager who publicly said he doesn't need more than 600,000 euros a year, the additional earnings of several millions he simply donates each year to foundations. The manager is Louis Gaulois from EATS, which is the successful aerospace competitor of Boeing. And Camdessus is active advocating a maximum wage 20 times the minimum wage. So let me come to an end and sum up. 3 points. Until now, global solidarity was an extension of national solidarity. If national solidarity is not reinforced but endangered, globalization will suffer. So anything we do on the global or European level, we'll have to supplement at the national one. Synchronization is a necessity. Second, Europe and the US will both have to confront their house divided, or their house will not stand. In Europe, this means unification will reverse systematically. The project will break down. In the US, it means its international soft power will wither away ever more because the city on the hill has acquired too many traits of Gotham City. Third, I think Catholic social teaching has to confront such houses divided more radically these days on both continents. Fighting poverty is a manageable task in a house undivided, in a common house, in a set of nations not split internally, and a set of nations externally amicably coordinated or supranationally consolidated. But once a house divided is firmly in place, fighting poverty becomes an insoluble task. It becomes a Sisyphus-like undertaking, and it throws the Church's moral posture into doubt. Preaching to the known deaf is not a plausible posture for long. Thank you.